Morgan, Texas hit its highest average positivity rate since the start of the pandemic, topping 20%. What are officials saying about that number?
They're saying that it needs to go down, and not just a little bit, Allison, but drastically. You see that 20% number there. That's one of the highest numbers that Texas has seen since this pandemic began. And just to put that in perspective, consider what the World Health Organization recommends, and that is a 7-day rolling positivity rate average of 5% or less. That is really the number you need to be hitting on a large-scale standpoint before those contact tracers can really start to do any good and actually try and corral and then track the spread of this virus. So until that number drops down considerably, we're going to be seeing a long road ahead, not just here in Texas, but any state, any community that has positivity rates that really exceed 5, as the health organization explains, or particularly 10. We know that city leaders have kind of had unofficial goals of trying to keep it below 10 or around 7, and that's frankly been unrealistic over the past several months as we've seen these cases in Texas just explode. Allison?
Morgan, some regions there struggling more than others. Could you tell us what's going on in some of the rural border communities? How are they doing? How are those counties coping?
Not well at all. In fact, the numbers there continue to rise, especially in South Texas. And it's important to note that they, of everywhere in Texas, have a unique set of disadvantages against everyone in that community. The doctors and nurses, they don't have a lot of healthcare resources. We know that federal teams have been deployed to that area, but they can only do so much help. And then on the patient side of things, you have multi-generational families living together in one home, basically transmitting the virus that much more easily. And you have 50% or below, 50% of the population down there basically living at or below the poverty line in Hidalgo County, in Starr County. And one community in particular over the past several weeks has gained an unfortunate amount of attention for all the wrong reasons, and that is Donna, Texas, in Hidalgo County. 7 out of every 100 people there have COVID-19, giving it one of the highest per capita rates of any community in the entire country. I had a chance to speak to Dr. Melendez, who works in a nearby hospital there, as he tried to explain the reason behind that rise in numbers. Take a listen.
I'm telling you, I started with HIV in the 1980s. I was in Afghanistan, Iraq. I've been in Baghdad. I've been in Fallujah. This is beyond what you can imagine. The pain, the loneliness, the telephone communication between the nurse, the patient, and their family, the dying alone, the people telling you, like just this morning, please send me home. I'd rather die at home than here.
And you hear that, and you see numbers getting better elsewhere, but that is the daily reality that still faces so many South Texans. And that is why there is an increasing amount of frustration, even as small improvements are seen on a statewide scale. Allison?
Yeah, you can certainly understand that frustration. Morgan, thanks for updating us on what's going on in Texas. Appreciate it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.